Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Seeking Harmony conversation today. And in today's topic, we're going to look at some things that we found to be newsworthy in this past week, and we would like for you to please join us. Feel free to share your thoughts, your experiences, any insights that you might have in relation to our topics today, and any questions that might stimulate the conversation a little bit further. So I think one of the things that stood out for me is probably the bigger one around the presidential election in Brazil. And how that rivalry between the two components was quite strong and quite head to head. And you kind of see it in the result where the incumbent president literally won by a very, very small margin. So for me, it was interesting how they seem to be, even though there's a significant shift in their politics, there's almost this very even, almost evenly distributed kind of balance happening at the moment. And for me, it just speaks to the desire of the country to bring a little bit more balance, and therefore finding their candidates almost kind of closer to each other with polls and things like that, even though it is said to have been a very divisive political election, and that there's a sentiment that it's likely that division is likely to show up in the future as these two parties settle into how this election has actually played out. So yeah, I'm going to open it up to everybody and see how you feel about it and what your thoughts and impressions have been about this presidential election.
I have to agree with you. I feel like the division and all the drama around just the shift in political party, and I've heard a lot of reports saying that Bolsonaro, they're wondering if he's going to, relinquish the power, if there's going to be just like this back and forth where he refuses to I guess give up his position. But I also think it's really interesting that Brazil apparently has 31 political parties. And in order to get anything done, I guess, politically, you have to form a lot of coalitions. And I was listening to a BBC podcast yesterday, and the reporter was interviewing someone within I don't know if they call it a Congress, but within the political realm in Brazil. And this man was saying that even if you were Jesus, you would have to make like a deal with Judas to get anything done. And that really stuck out to me, because I think it's so telling of kind of where they're at and I guess the issues that they're faced with. And it's funny to even think that someone like Jesus would even need to make a choice like that. I feel like, Jesus would be above that anyway. But, the fact that I feel like it was really getting at, even if you want to do good and there's good intention, there's so much opposition around it that you kind of have to sell yourself or, diminish what you really want to do to get anything done. So I'm really interested in how that's all going to move forward, and, what it's going to look like in the coming days.
Yeah. Well, I think that I feel that's an interesting thing that they said. And that there's, well, it's like a feeling of like, yeah, you have to like compromise your values and seeing the other side as being an enemy, and one who stands for, evil basically, and that your side stands for goodness. And it could be in some ways, and at times in certain ways, but I think that just tells more about like the feeling there, and that it's very like divided, like they're at least among like maybe the general public, or maybe certain people, like there's a feeling of like, that distrust, or that like animosity, where like one side, well, both sides think the other one is like basically a huge threat, like an existential threat to the country. And maybe it is, because in a way for them, because there's a feeling of like what we feel is important to like who we are and our identity, I don't know, might somehow be I don't know, threatened by that, which in truth it's not really possible, but I think that view, it just points to a feeling of like we need to like make society change through, like, it's focusing on changing society, but of course the real solution is ultimately like to change yourself, and for people who are changing themselves, like work together and come together. But I don't know, personally, I wouldn't know what to do in that scenario. But what I feel is that the best thing to do is just to like do the best that you can in that climate, because it is a democracy, and so you have to respect, that it's democracy, and you have to do what you can, for what you value and care about, and talk about it and decide what's really important. And yeah, I think it's necessary, and that's a huge theme, in this election, I felt, was like about democracy itself, and whether people agreed that it should be a democratic country, or if, like people were saying like, oh, like Bolsonaro himself was saying like, oh, maybe the armed forces will, he was basically saying like, oh, I have a good close relationship with the armed forces, so don't know if I'm going to lose this one, even if I do lose. And so I was like, oh my goodness, that's like, I don't, it was alarming to me, because I was like, whoa, that's like not really cool. But I learned that Brazil had a dictatorship 37 years ago. So like, that's not too long ago, So I feel like it's kind of Brazil really asking itself like, what do we really want, and do we believe in, democracy and everything, that's what I was feeling about it.
So what I found interesting was that I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Lula is kind of has been their president from 2003 to 2010. And I feel like it, it speaks once again to something that we spoke about last week, about kind of almost returning to what was known in the past, and that deep desire for stability. So like when you bring up the point that the opposition in this election, saying that he has had this strong relationship with the military forces and things like that, you kind of have to wonder, like, both of them have had these significantly powerful roles, and they have a level of influence. And so how much of that influence has played out in people's minds in returning to what was familiar, but also into just kind of re-establishing relationships that are already there that might take things forward. The other thing that I find interesting, and it's what you shared about Andrea, is the sense that they're almost forced to cooperate with each other in order to achieve something. And yes, I get the dichotomy of like you kind of almost have to make a deal with the devil to achieve something, but at the same time, you kind of see that there seems to be a lot more of a sense of checks and balances with the amount of political parties in that space. Like they can't be a lot of unilateral decision making, which to me would say that maybe there's a definite shift, even though they're a younger democracy, there's a definite shift away from that level of dictatorial rule that they had before. And this is why they require so much greater cohesion to make changes in a country, or even just to move in a certain direction. And so offhand, yes, I mean, you know, making a deal with the devil doesn't sound like a great plan, but at the same time, for all intents and purposes, the devil also has his supporters in that space, right? And they also want something. So I just feel like it's forcing a deeper level of cooperation, even though there might be two extremes in terms of 2 or 3 or even 4 extremes in the party politics around them. But it's still forcing that they cannot unilaterally make decisions and inadvertently push the country back into a level of dictatorial rule.
I also feel like this election, I'm really glad that Lula won, and it was by so few, but I feel like it really shows the power of choice though too that Brazil has, and Brazil as a whole did make this choice. They made the choice. I believe that Lula really represents freedom, or more freedom, like we said, like going away from that dictatorship and more toward freedom. And although it's by a very small margin, he's still, Brazil is choosing that, and I think that's very powerful. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just glad too in terms of climate change, because there will be less deforestation with him too. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm happy about that too, because what's been going on in the Amazon is a issue that I've been following for a long time, because it's just so it's so sad to just see the earth kind of degraded and not respected in that way, and then indigenous communities are affected, and all in the name of capitalism. So it's nice to see that the Brazilian people have made a different choice, and hopefully with Lula coming back, because I think when he was president before, he had a lot of good social welfare policies and did a lot of things to help individuals in the lower income brackets. But apparently Brazil is not in the same economic state. So there's a question on, what he'll be able to do moving forward. But, just based off the comparison, Bolsonaro seems to be very much of a businessman and more focused on industry, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But, when you're doing it and degrading the earth and causing damage and further harm, that becomes problematic. So hopefully, since he was president, he will be able to maybe find more common ground and be able to build these coalitions, so to say, to actually get things done, instead of just having it be a sort of like political back and forth and not really getting anything done, which I think happens a lot in the US Congress. We only have 2 political parties. So you know, the fact that they have 31 is just, I thought Germany had the most political parties with 9. And so this is a new one for me. I didn't realize they had so many. But it makes sense as a response to dictatorship to, you know, have so many groups.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And I think, yeah, first of all, like Lula, when he was president before, he had a very good like economic situation on his side. And so it will be interesting to see how he can manage at this time. And also, I definitely think that Bolsonaro was focused on business, but I think when it comes at the expense of like social laws, health, and also like environmental laws, it can be very destructive, and the people did not agree with it, especially because he had kind of a poor management of the crisis, you know. And so I don't think like there's a state like ever since I think 2016 or 2018, ever since like the big corruptions exposed in Brazil, there's been a state of like division. And I don't think it's gonna calm down just yet, but I do hope, as you said, that the parliament will form a good enough coalition so that they can work together to like kind of extinguish that fire that everyone's been pulling on the public place, political figures, and just focus on having something that is stable and good enough for Brazil. And yeah, here we are again talking about stability. I think Brazil is also making that choice in a sense, even though it looks different that what we saw in the UK and Europe. I think it's still a choice of stability. It's relevant to what we were talking about last week. Yeah.
And I feel like too, it was like, I think there was just like that people were deciding, or at least like thinking about like what makes a good society and what makes it stable. And I think like I think for some it may feel really good to have a society where there's like a strong like a figure, at least a figure of like a strong leader who you can be like, oh, this is our guy, he's leading us to prosperity. And it's like looking for like, you know, someone who's like a strong man or something. And I think Bolsonaro represented more of that, you know. And I think for people who felt like individualism and being more like, you know, like I can like pull myself up by my bootstraps and stuff like that. Like that's kind of the same dichotomy that exists in the US too. What I'm feeling is that there's, you know, those who like favor like less regulations for industry and actually more government help for industry too. So it's not totally laissez-faire, but so that like, is that stability, like just everyone acting as kind of like an individual and trying to make it for themselves, or collectivism and like doing stuff that is like meant to support the collective and everything like that. And that obviously like with certain things, like you have to have like a collectivistic mentality for like preserving things like the Amazon rainforest. Because if you're looking at it just from a self-interested perspective, like you could very well like just use up all of the forest, or a large portion of it for like what you want to do, and not think about the fact that like the rainforest is part of like the collective well-being of everyone, and also your well-being too. So I think there's like, it's seen as a dichotomy, like self-interest and like collective interest, but I think the truth is that like obviously they're not a dichotomy, but there's so much confusion about that, you know, and it's not totally split between those two things, because I think Bolsonaro was like more like traditional values, you know, traditional family, like, you know, not recognizing or supporting LGBT people, whereas Lula's more like allowing there, and like more liberal and more for people's like individual expression there. So yeah, but yeah, I don't know, but I feel like all of these things, like this election decision, it was like so like razor thin. I feel like the society is still really, really in conversation and in dialogue and debate, and there's not really a lot of agreement yet. I think it's just very split, and yeah, it's different. It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. Yeah, it reminds me of the US. It's like almost exactly like the US, I feel, in that way. I mean, if someone knows more, you can tell me, because but it feels so
Yeah.
parallel, and people
Their
would call
political
like Trump
political system is like inspired by the US
oh,
and its
Okay.
structure. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, it kind of feels like that.
I thought the same too. So definitely all the contention and, you know, the division instead of trying to find common ground. I feel like we've been in the US, it's been very similar. It's past a couple election cycles. So yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. Why in these cases does it feel like there's not common ground? Like why does it feel so divided, you know?
Well, I remember a conversation with Jeff where I said that basically for right and left sides of the political spectrum, what they do not see is that they are the different sides of the same coin, and that without them, there's no, you know, kind of like, I don't know, fuel to get to move forward and to have change and to bring peace into the government. And so they're fighting instead of, because we're scared of like losing ground, instead of seeing that they are two contingent parts of a really well thought system, basically, and that they each have like very specific role and goal, I guess, to make a country move forward and to protect the economy and the people and enforce democracy. And that it's all part of democracy, but I think people have a tendency to forget that it is definitely the role of democracy to have these political changes and to have this debate and to have differences, and that it should not be something of division and separation, but actually something of discussion and peace. Like, for example, what we are doing here, we're not like always agreeing to the same things, but like by talking, we move forward like week after week, and we find core truths and maybe common ground, you know? So yeah, I think like it's how can I say this? They don't see exactly like the truth of what political parties are for, and that creates division. But it shouldn't, ideally.
Yeah, and I agree with you that there's definitely a requirement for a healthy amount of debate. And I mean, we've seen it countless times where there's too much of the same thought process. There's often change takes longer. It's also sometimes slower, but it's also sometimes not the best idea. And so the debate does need to happen to surface almost to surface the good ground, to surface the good paving, to surface a healthier direction. Just because there's arguments on both sides of a debate does not mean that the debate is not moving forward. And it's probably much more healthy and much more necessary, even if it feels like there's great amounts of animosity. And I feel like the core of that animosity is a level of conflict about power. It's what Andrea was speaking to. It's like people are not necessarily prepared to relinquish their foothold or what they believe to be their seats of power. And so it often plays out as a battle of wills for power, which is not always in the best interests of the population of a country, for instance. And so I feel like if political parties in a political arena chose to act in the best interests of their constituents as opposed to having very personal agendas, we might see a significant shift in what political parties and governments are then able to achieve.
I definitely agree with your last point. I think I see that a lot in the United States, just the way people run campaigns and, you know, the process of being elected. It for most people, that I see, it feels like it's kind of you know, like an ego race for them. Like they're just there to present themselves, and it's more about who they are as an individual, but not necessarily how they can like I don't know how to, like, what their abilities are to kind of help bridge these gaps. I feel like it's, you know, I don't know how to articulate it. But it is very egotistical. It's very self-centered. There's like this lack of awareness about, I don't know if it's lack of awareness, but just totally ignoring the fact that, you know, like what Yoreen said, that there's, it's all kind of the same thing. It's the system that we've all, you know, built together, and it's meant to function with these different sides and to, you know, come into harmony with these differences. Because just because there's differences, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. But I feel like the way it's presented, especially in the US, it's that, oh, well, it has to be this way. It can't be that way. Like there's no attempt to reach a common ground. And especially in the last two cycles of the elections, just like the level of vitriol, and it did not feel good to me to witness it. It felt like we were kind of moving further away from that that cohesion. So I don't know if you see the same in South Africa or in France, but I imagine it's it's a global thing. It just looks different in, you know, every country.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, and I think you did the primary thing that you spoke to is the absolute picture in my mind as well, that level of incohesion. And again, it's literally because of a deep, desperate desire to hang on to power and to believe that, and believing that compromising and finding agreement with very with topics that have been quite a debate seems to be almost the level of ego death that politicians and political parties don't choose to even entertain or consider, because their identity is so almost so ingrained in their party politics, which is generally a problem for the population. It's not always the political party that suffers at the end of the day. It's actually, it leads to a level of suffering for the population, because as opposed to making the strides that bring societies closer together, that shift economies, they all feel very strongly about their proposed and reported position, and they're not often comfortable to give up ground in opposition to their own position. So there's always the battle, but the shift doesn't quite, it doesn't make significant strides. You know, like there's partial shifts, and generally at the expense of something or other. I think that's part of the challenge of what politics does. It's like there's a lot of sense of at the expense of what is this happening. And generally, it's at the expense of the people. It's not always at the expense of the political party. It's not at the expense of a political agenda. No matter how strongly they feel about it, no matter how strongly their identities are wrapped up in their political agendas, there's always the part of society that's kind of, for lack of a better phrasing, left behind because people aren't able to find that level of cohesion that's necessary within a country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's about humility, like people. So it's kind of like the difference between like what, from a perspective of like the illusion or ego, power looks like arrogance, but in truth, power is humble, you know, and humility is powerful, and just really, really setting down any thing that you preconceived notions and just being like, what is, you know, really best here? What is really the truth? And just letting yourself admit that you might not know it, but you definitely have some indication, ideas. And yeah, I think it's just, I mean, I think the reason the world might be so divided too is because it's a time of greater, like, ego death, like you were saying, like illusions are like crumbling more in the world, and just how like we're seeing this illusion again with the Ukraine war coming up again of like domination and the pillage and plunder mentality, and that makes a nation great. That ego thing, that specter is coming up with Russia, but the world is kind of getting better and better at like beating that back and putting a boundary up and saying no to that, compared to before, you know, when like World War II was like a huge like expense of energy and life and everything, you know. Now this is a bit more contained and like much more like there is no appeasement here, there's just a boundary. And so I think that that process of the ego death is like just increasing, maybe and accelerating. And so that's why the division feels so much louder, because that pain point of feeling like, oh, like arrogance is power is being highlighted more. And it's becoming more like accentuated in everyone's life and everything in their minds. Like, what is power? Like, is it this like arrogance, or is it this humility? And yeah, is it like us versus them, or is it about like, I don't know, finding the real truth, basically? Yeah.
So I think you shared, you spoke to something quite important, but I also think there's something additional to that, is that at the core of it, I'm starting to wonder if political parties actually understand their purpose. And are they actually serving their purpose? Because it might look to us on the surface like there's significant amounts of conflict, but if that debate, that high level of debate is their purpose, then they're serving their purpose really well, no matter what it looks like on the outside.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think like as long as people have different opinions and about something, like you need that, the different political parties, and you might need more balance. Like, I don't know, like this region like has had a lot of like industry laissez-faire, and it's had a lot of like pollution. And for example, like Brazil, like with the Amazon, okay, like that'd be an instance where like the liberal side of the spectrum is needed to step in and provide like some of their wisdom, and then it's like if political parties worked like that, and they were more like I don't know, like specialists kind of in the hospital or whatever, like, oh, I'm the lungs person, I'm all about advocating for the lungs. And then this person's like, oh, I'm the stomach person, I'm the skin person. It's like, well, if we need those different people who have those different viewpoints, but it's, and there's something valid in each of them. But if you know what I mean? And obviously with the body, we know like the stomach isn't in competition with the lungs, right? Everyone knows that. But so there's no like, battle of wills there probably, but you know what I'm saying? Like they have their function, but yeah, they're not seeing it that way.
Yeah, I think they're forgetting that their function is to be of service to people, not to be of service to the party. And sometimes it requires, maybe when you're in Congress or Parliament, saying that, oh, actually, my opponent's view on health is pretty good. What about we implement it for the greater good of everyone? It's not about like winning votes for the next election, next midterms, next presidentials, It's about really doing something that is good for the public, and not, like, as Angel likes to say, throwing vitriol on the situation that needs to have peace. But yeah, once like people see their situation as service to others, being a leader is a service to other people, I think our political views will drastically change. But I think the world is not here yet. I'm hoping we'll be here in the next few years, because it's kind of tiring to see things being like a battlefield, political battlefield. But yeah, who knows if it's needed for people to learn a lesson.
Yep, agreed. And on that note, I feel like it's a good place to move into our next topic. Specifically, again, and I think just that word battlefield for me, when you now look at the less violent battlefield of a soccer tournament like the World Cup, and then you have a significant challenge around what is allowed and not allowed from populations visiting a country. into a country that has a very specific culture, a very specific way of looking at life, a very specific way of expecting their population to show up and behave, it starts to make you wonder, what purpose does the World Cup serve in bringing countries together when individuals have been told to tone themselves down, tone their lifestyles down, and maybe some have even gone to the extent of being told not to visit countries because things like same-sex marriage or same-sex activity is punishable, is potentially punishable by death. You kind of have to wonder where that almost, again, cohesion is, and when does it start to surface, and when do we as a people, a global people, start to actually make the choice to allow for very specific, very entrenched individual freedom, and not making excuses for any behavior that places other people at risk. But when do we make the argument for strongly individually supported, respected, and protected freedom?
Oh, yeah. Are you talking about it? It sounded like you're talking about like we're all individuals who have the right to do what, feels best to us, like without harming others, or, infringing on that or taking part in that. Yeah, I totally know what you mean, because I know a lot of the discussion about this, like basically LGBTQ visitors in Qatar, basically being told, like, to, depending on who's talking, right, being told to tone down their LGBTness, their gayness, and like don't like show public displays of affection, and don't do this and don't do that, you know what I mean? And yeah, I think that, so I think one thing that I've been noticing when I've been looking at it is, in Qatar, the dialogue coming from the Qatari government has been, oh, we have our own culture, and respect our like culture, and it's just all this like scrutiny of us and all this criticism just boils down to the West having like racism toward us and antipathy toward us being Muslim, basically, in our culture. And that like probably does exist, but I think that that's a distraction aimed at like poking at people's guilt, basically a distraction from the core issue, right? That's being like, because obviously there it is an issue. We all know, like, racism exists in the world. I can't say it, but the core issue is, people's, the acceptance of people and the freedom for them to be themselves, and whether it is disrespectful to behave in a way that, people in a certain country's culture don't see as good or as acceptable. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, but the thing is, like, what is the point of having these cultural norms? Is it to try to control and force what you believe on another person, or is it for you to align with what is truly good and loving? Like, is it about you living out your values, or is it about you wanting others to live out your values? You know what I'm saying? And so if you truly believe in like whatever, this or that, then you should practice it yourself, and others can see if they see the good in it or not. You know what I mean? Because that's what it sounds like. It sounds like that's what it's about, you know? What do you think? What are you gonna say?
So right off the bat, I'm gonna say that the situation in Qatar is way deeper than that, because the reason why some broadcast television and some people are choosing not to view or not to broadcast the World Cup is because Qatar, well, it's like, it's not like a country where you can like express yourself as an LGBTQ person, but it's very much not respecting a lot of human rights, or said to not respect a lot of human rights. A lot of like workers have died or have been injured during the construction of this event, and Qatar is set to welcome other international events in the next few years, including Olympic Games. So, and they refuse to give compensation for all the workers that have died, and they're also set to finance with all the money that they gain from like football clubs and investments and selling of arms, very set to finance terrorism in some parts of the world. And so it seems like it isn't really like it seems way deeper than just not respecting like LGBTQ people, but I think it's the same. It's the same thing of like, what is Qatar choosing as a country, and as what is the international scene choosing to support by allowing Qatar to host these events just because they have money? It would be easy to say, oh, like, we don't have to worry about the next international games because we are hosting it, of course, and they're part of like big economic investments in the world. But just the fact that they seem to breach so many human rights is just outrageous. And so we would choose to close our eyes to that. And so we have chosen basically to close our eyes to the issue at the moment. And so it comes as no surprise, even though it's super disrespectful, that some UK minister would say to its people to tone down their affection to one another when they're in Qatar. And I agree with you, Sage, that it's just a distraction from the deeper problem. The fact that Qatar says like it's our culture and you have to respect that, because it actually is. It's a big distraction to the fact that they don't have morals and don't respect human rights in so many places. But yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I kind of had a similar reaction. First of all, I thought it was a little inappropriate for the UK minister to come out and say that. But I feel like it's also a cop-out for Qatar to be pushing it as a cultural issue. Because I don't buy it. I don't believe it. You know, it's not accepting people because they're different from you is not necessarily a cultural issue. I think it goes deeper to what Yoreen was saying, that the country, the leadership has a very deep record of just ignoring human rights. And this is, you know, one aspect of it. But the fact that, you know, FIFA supports hosting the games there. The fact that the UK minister feels like he has to come out and tell British people to be different, essentially, but there's no one kind of holding Qatar accountable for what they have done and, you know, how they go about treating their own people and just the issues within the country. You know, because the Middle East, I mean, Iran included, I'm familiar with Iran just because both my parents are from there. I mean, it's the same sort of issue. LGBTQ individuals are not protected. It's not safe if you are outwardly, you know, expressing yourself in the way that comes natural to you. But I don't buy that as an issue with the culture, because Iranian culture is very open. It's very hospitable. These things have developed because leadership has made choices, you know, Iran becoming an Islamic republic and taken all of these, you know, lies about religion and God and kind of forcing it onto people. I feel like it's a very similar thing happening in Qatar. And it's not the first time, you know, it's not the first time that they've been involved in like international games and just hosting sporting events. And the fact that FIFA, I feel like, you know, there's some responsibility with FIFA as a governing body to be mindful of these things. And I feel like it really just boils down to money. And so I just wish there was better response from like actual leadership. You know, why would anyone have to change who they are when they're at a sporting event? I mean, it just doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I just, you know, I think like when you think about it, that it's it's literally a soccer tournament among 64 countries who have qualified in one way or another to play a freaking game.
Yeah.
And as a result of a game, there's all this controversy. But this controversy is only being highlighted because they are now newsworthy. Before, these human rights abuses have kind of been ignored. And if not ignored, very much avoided. And it's, as you say, Andia, it's not only in that space. I mean, it's that it's probably quite prevalent across what is seen to be the Arab-speaking Persian Gulf. So Dubai, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. There's all of those things where you have to wonder at which point do human rights start to also be important? Because these are a lot of countries that generally are very rich because of rich oil repositories and things like that, and are very well respected from a business point of view in certain respects. I mean, you know, you constantly hear about business opportunities in those Arab countries. The issue is then, how comfortable are we from a human rights point of view to participate in that kind of stuff? You know, like, are we getting rich at the cost of people? Because this is really what it boils down to. It boils down to riches versus humanity at the end of the day. And are there maybe governing bodies like FIFA that are so much more interested in profiting that they will turn a blind eye to certain human rights abuses? And then you know, just to have the legacy of people dying in the construction of stadiums and things like that, and to make the decision not to compensate them, like, you have to wonder what type of labor practices happen in those countries. So, you know, the implication of it is that once the exploration is probably going to surface far more things than what we may have been made to be aware of. And what are the implications in the long term for us continuing to support and do business with countries like that? It's what you were talking to earlier, Sage, around, you know, the world is putting up boundaries in certain respects with countries like Russia invading other countries and things like that. What boundaries are being put up in respect of humanity and people's rights and human rights? I mean, we've seen it in one of our previous conversations around things that the abuse of women's rights within the United Nations kind of thing. So we have to wonder at which point does this perpetual stream of disrespect end?
Touching on a good point there, because I think, and yet you touched on it, I think Iran, like the international scene made the choice to like put a boundary on Iran and on Russia, but it was pretty late. And there's no boundaries on Bahrain and Qatar and Arab Union Emirates, where we see like almost a replica of some of the things that were playing out in Iran, because they were like trading oil, being rich and culturally diverse, or like having a lot of migrants in and things like that. But like, we have to wonder, is like the economy so much more important than human rights? What are we putting forth? What are we prioritizing? And are we putting a boundary when it's way too late, time and again? And when are we going to put a boundary soon enough that it will actually make a difference, that we won't have to go to war with these countries to make them understand that in the international equilibrium of things, this is not okay? You know, that's just like what I was asking myself. Sage, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted to say too that it does remind me too of like, so I remember I think in a sermon like of the Church of Union, Jeff and Shaleia were talking about like politics, and they were using Russia as an example, and they were saying like Russia has a great thing to share in its culture, at the heart of its culture. It's beautiful, but they're still figuring out how to share it. And so it's like, that's an example of like, there are great things at the heart of, for example, in Qatari culture, Arab culture, Islam, these are beautiful things, but you can't just say like that your culture is abuse of human rights, slavery, and dictatorship. Because if you say that, then you're saying that like ego is a part of your culture, you know, and it's not, but it could be ingrained that it is, you know. And so yeah, I was feeling that.
Okay, cool. So I think on that point, it's something to ponder, but definitely I think it's something to explore further as a topic later down the line. For today, thank you to everybody for the conversation. Thank you to everybody that has joined us. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations and any other live discussions that have happened in our Unionism Spiritual Discussion Group on Facebook. And we look forward to seeing all of you again next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Right.